Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we tackle a single relevant question based on our Bible reading for that day. This week our reading is centered around the book of 3 John. Today I'm joined by Sheryl Daughety and Jay Rivenbark. We're going to look at a question from verses 9 and 10 of 3 John and then Romans 8, 31 through 39. But let's stick with 3 John right now. He says, I wrote to the church about this, but Diotrephes, who loves to be a leader, refuses to have anything to do with us. When I come, I will report some of the things he is doing and the evil accusations he is making against us. Not only does he refuse to welcome traveling teachers, he also tells others not to help them, and when they do, he puts them out of the church. So yesterday we talked about supporting the traveling preachers. Here he calls out Diotrephes, who is enamored with being a leader, but he's divisive. He wants his ways. It's about control. So and I don't know whether we should talk about this individually or as a church, because I think they are slightly different, how you deal with them. But how do you deal with divisive people?
Well, I think he gives us some insights here as relates to approaches. One, he does call him out on the front end. He points out what apparently everybody else already knows. He says who loves to be the leader, not a leader,
right?
The leader. He
wants to have the most influence.
Absolutely, 100%, without question. But then he shifts a little bit and he says, when I come, I will report some of the things he's doing and the evil accusations he's making against us. He's pointing out, here's a problem. This is the problem. This person's the problem. But what I need to talk to you about in greater detail needs to be face to face. It needs to be on the level that I can see you, look you in the eye, answer questions that you may have, because you can't do that in a letter. You can't do that in an email. You can't do that in a text. That's right.
Yeah.
And even if you do, a lot of times the feelings, the emotions, the message that you're trying to convey can be misconstrued. So he starts out by saying, here is a problem. He is the problem. But I'm going to get into the details when we can sit down and have this conversation and talk about it. And he gives some basic outlines of the problems that are going on, but he's going to get down to some other issues that aren't even exposed at this point when he has that face-to-face conversation.
Which I think also points to how he's handling it, because, as you said, he has not divulged all the information. There's no need for everybody to have
know everything.
Yes, all the details.
For it to be read in front of the whole church.
That's right.
Because that's what's happening.
Yes.
Here. Yeah, I think that is, where did I hear this? It may have been at the same place where I gave the illustration yesterday and some of the teaching they were doing. I guess it was. He said we should be 100% transparent and truthful with everybody. But there should be different levels of facts that we reveal based on that person's ability to deal with it. So, and the example that he gave was with his children. He said sometimes there may be things that are overwhelming him, creating stress in their marriage. He didn't use this example, but this is the one I would use. So let's say there's some type of infidelity between a husband and a wife, and it's creating stress in the home. Everybody can see the stress, like you can't escape it. And if a kid asks about it, you have to be transparent and say, yes, we're working through some things. But you don't back the dump truck up.
Right, dump the whole load
on that kid and say, your mom cheating on me, or and I see parents do that all the time. They think transparency is they got to know everything, and that's just not true. And that's what he's doing. That's what I read when I read this. He's like, this is going to be read in front of the church, and all of you need to know what kind of person this person is. But if we're going to talk about details, we don't need to do that.
Yeah, because even in the church world, there are situations and events that happen that that are appropriate for you to say publicly in a particular format. But then,
or may require you to say
that's
publicly.
right. But then there are people who come to you privately that may have specific questions or concerns that you may address and add to, depending on the person, the level, and the need to know, whereas you wouldn't necessarily do that across the board to everybody.
Yeah, well, even in our context, for example, I can think of situations where one group of people had to know for governance reasons, but you can't tell everybody.
Mhm.
You just cannot. You can't do it. You know, there are liabilities to it. There are problems with it. You know, there's just lots of pieces to it. And, you know, he's saying, okay, you got to know who the person is, but you can't dump all the facts on everybody.
I would say from a different perspective on this one, you know, he jumps in there and names the problem.
Mm-hmm.
He gives a little bit of insight, but then he's going to deal with it on a more personal level when he gets there. I have seen in the church the lack of willingness to do this.
This piece of it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, to say, this is the problem. They are the problem. These are the facts. And so therefore people only had blanks to fill in themselves and made assumptions or what they were told, usually by the problem themselves. And I have literally have seen, and one I'm thinking of in particular, where a church eventually split because nobody did this.
Mm.
Nobody said, here's the facts. And in that situation, the church they didn't need to know every detail, but they needed to know enough of the issue and the problem so that people could say, oh, okay, didn't realize that. Therefore, I'm going to hunker down and do the right thing and continue moving forward rather than being left to fill in, you know, their own pieces based on what was not truth. So that's dangerous not to address it. Why are you laughing?
Double D. That's all I was thinking about. I was thinking about a situation that I think you probably could relate to with a person. Anyway, I need to move on from that before I reveal.
Yeah, before you accidentally
say their name.
Oops.
In the last 24 hours, I've had a conversation with somebody who stood and told me how much trouble they had caused. And they knew they had caused lots of trouble. And they didn't know what to do.
Mm.
And I said, well, I think there's 3 steps. One, you got to stop. It's got to stop. There's got to be an end to it. Mm. Second, you need to go try to make things right. And third, you need to move on and never look back. Mm. And sometimes people can't do those things. They can't. They just can't. And there are people who are divisive that don't mean to be divisive. Mm-hmm. You know, they say things that are negative or don't put the best face on things. And I'm thinking of an illustration that I want to use right now that I can't. And they don't realize when
I've
they
been thinking about all sorts of stuff. I've been having a hard time following along because I keep thinking about all
they don't
situations.
Realize the impact that they're having on the other people who are there. Mm-hmm. For them, it's a joke. Mm-hmm. You know, they say it harmlessly. But for the people at the table, they go, oh, you know, this really? And dealing with divisive people in the church for me, it's different than in my personal life. In my personal life, if you're divisive, I just avoid you. Like, I can make the choice. Like, I can ignore your phone call. Yeah. I don't have to go to dinner with you. I don't have to have you to my house. Like, I can just surgically remove you out of my life. It's really simple. I don't have to confront you. I can just say, you know, I ain't having nothing to do. In the church, that's much more difficult. Yeah. In the church, my calling and my job requires me to pastor everybody when they're being pains and when they're not. To try to. I don't know. My wife says, "Why are you doing?" I said, "Because I'm called to pastor everybody. I got to. Don't have any choice. And it requires a little bit more nuance now. Divisive, when I'm thinking divisive, and what I mean by here when I say divisive is not just they disagree with something.
Correct.
They're trying to convince everybody
Other
else
people.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's what's going on
Yeah,
here.
because he says he tells them not to help, and when they do, he puts them out of the church.
Right. Yeah.
And so he is demanding you think the way I think, you act the way I act, or else.
Right.
There are repercussions. That's a whole different level.
Exactly. Now those people have to be confronted. You have to deal with it, and you should do it privately first, and then if you can't, then you have to deal with it publicly. And typically what will happen is churches will split or they will disintegrate. That's more what I see happening is churches disintegrate. There's not a lot of church splitting going on anymore, even though I can think of two really recently. But it's more the church disintegrates. The people fade away. The divisive people stay most of the time. They end up, and the people who want what's best, like, okay, I don't want to deal with this. I'm going to go to another church. I don't know what's y'all's experience with divisive people in the church.
When Jay was referring to the fact that he felt like the thing or person wasn't often identified, I also feel like something else that I don't see happening often in there is the ability to confront and talk about it. That you didn't divulge all the details and that you went to that person and had to confront them with whatever that thing is that has become divisive that they were responsible for. Because those are uncomfortable conversations to have, and most people don't want to have them. And so I think that they often get said everywhere except for who they should have been
in the
said
right
to.
place.
I had an experience recently, and I got to be very generic here, where somebody reached out to me and said, we got this issue and this problem. If it's not resolved and fixed, we're leaving the church. And I'm thinking, what in the world?
Mm-hmm.
And then they commenced to tell me the person calling me wasn't even there, wasn't even part of the conversation that took place. And I said, wait a minute. I said, first problem is they need to talk to me if they got a problem or issue. But here's what I'm going to tell them, so you can go ahead and tell them, is they need to go back to the person they have an offense with and deal with that. And then if you can't get somewhere, then come see me. But I'm not going to do this. And they said, okay, well, I'll do that. And thank God they did. They had the courage to go back to that person they had an offense with, and they had an open conversation between two parties, and both of the parties are still connected, still active, and as if things never happened, and I was like, yes, that's a win. When you can practice that, that's what we should do. Doesn't necessarily always happen.
What's the worst divisive thing y'all have ever heard, seen, been a part of? You told, I'm sure you were a part of that church split. Yeah. Was it, how painful was that for you?
Oh, it was beyond painful. And the most frustrating part for me was the lack of willingness on leadership at a high level to stand flat-footed and tell the truth from the pulpit. Their position was, give it enough time, it'll take care of itself, it'll go away. Well, it didn't.
No, it won't.
It didn't go away. The problem did go up not far away, and about 70% of the people went because they didn't know the truth.
Right. Yeah.
And truth would have set them free.
But I almost said their name while ago. I did.
Well.
But they have a track record.
Yes.
They had a track record of 40 years of doing that same junk.
Yes.
And if they're still living, they're still doing it.
100%.
That's the worst hurt outside of divorce. The worst hurt I've ever had was church trouble like that.
100%, because what we experienced, through that process, people that we had worshiped with and been in homes, and they in our homes many, many times, and that I thought the relationships were strong enough to continue outside of that dimension. And I kid you not, people would cross the street on the opposite side to avoid making contact to have to speak. And that was heartbreaking.
I've heard
It was
stories about
devastating.
how this church started and some of those same things. The most painful thing I watched, as a church my dad pastored, last church he pastored, and I had left to go pastor myself. And he wanted to move the church. And the church was in a neighborhood that most of the people weren't living there. They weren't ministering in that neighborhood. So he'd wanted to move it over to a nicer part of town. He had worked out a deal to buy some land, and it turned into a knockdown, drag out brawl where people were, I remember I went back for a business meeting just to help support my dad. And, stupid things people were saying. You remodeled the parsonage and put a $70,000 door on the front door. Like, where do you get a $70,000 door from in 1995?
Oh,
what is it,
man.
gold plated? It might have been $700. Anyway, the church ended, about 100 of the people ended up leaving the church. And do you know what they did? They went and bought the piece of land that they didn't want the church to move to and build a church on the very piece of land.
Wow.
And put a $70,000 door on it.
Yeah, exactly. And I thought, God, you got some nerve. You split a church because you didn't want the church to move, and then you go buy a very piece of land and build a church on it that they were going to move to. It's
That's
just
divisive.
terrible.
That says to me that the issue was not what they thought.
No,
What
it
they were
won't.
claiming the issue was.
And in that situation, there were family members. I mean, brothers and sisters who didn't speak for years, sons and daughters who didn't speak for years. It's a shame. Well, listen, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back tomorrow with us as we continue a conversation around 3 John.